horror story. Part 1. Adrian paused outside the gates of St. Helena Hospital, staring at the familiar gray mass of concrete. It looked the same, yet not the same. The walls leaned at strange angles. The windows reflected too much darkness, and the air around the building seemed unnaturally cold. He told himself it was memory. He had not stepped inside since his mother died here years ago, and grief reshaped places into something monstrous. Still, the unease coiled in his stomach refused to loosen. The sliding doors opened with a reluctant hiss. He entered, and the lobby greeted him with a silence too heavy for a functioning hospital. Fluorescent bulbs trembled overhead, buzzing faintly, as though their light was fragile and on the verge of collapse. The air carried disinfectant, but beneath it lingered another scent: copper, damp plaster, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. The receptionist sat behind the desk, motionless until he approached. Her smile bloomed too wide, her lips stretched as if carved there. Before he spoke, she whispered, "Third floor, room 309. The words were smooth, memorized. She never asked his name. Adrian tried to respond, but her eyes fixed on him, black and glassy. The silence pressed so hard against him that he simply nodded and turned away. The elevator was already waiting. Its doors yawned open as though expecting him. The panel of numbers blinked in the wrong order as the car ascended. 1, 5, 2, 4, then abruptly 3. The shudder of machinery vibrated through his chest like a slow heartbeat. The hallway stretched long and dim. Frosted glass doors lined both sides, each with blurred shapes shifting inside. Or perhaps not. Every time Adrian focused, the movement ceased. The smell of mildew mixed with the sterile odor, as if rot was seeping beneath the floor. Room 309 was at the very end. Its number plate hung crooked, the metal corroded at the edges. Scratches clustered around the handle as though desperate hands had tried to enter or escape. Inside, the light was thin, filtered through blinds that should not have been closed. A single bed stood against the wall. The sheets were not neatly folded but ruffled, bearing the impression of a body that had just vacated them. A chair faced the bed, turned slightly outward, as if a watcher had left moments earlier. On the bedside table lay a folder. His name was typed neatly on the cover. His throat tightened. He had not told anyone his name. He opened it with shaking hands. Pages of medical data filled the file. Erratic graphs, pulse lines broken by jagged interruptions, notes scribbled with haste. Most were illegible, scratched in different inks and hands. He doesn't know he is still here. The shadows in the corners deepened, swelled like lungs filling with breath. Adrian's eyes darted to the bed. For a moment, the sheet rose, then fell, as though an invisible chest had taken one slow inhale. He stumbled backward into the hallway. It no longer looked the same. The corridor seemed stretched, the distance to the elevator impossibly long. The lights flickered one by one, leaving patches of gloom between them. Then came the sound, footsteps squeaking faintly on the linoleum. They were not his. He spun around. The corridor was empty. The sound stopped at once. Adrian turned back and almost ran toward the elevator. His finger jabbed the button. The small light blinked, but the doors refused to open. The footsteps resumed, closer now, steady and deliberate. He pounded the button again and again. At last, the doors slid open with a sluggish groan. Relief dissolved instantly. The elevator was different, larger, deeper. Hospital beds lined both walls. Each bed held a figure beneath a thin sheet. The sheets moved faintly, rising and falling in shallow rhythm. The corridor behind him whispered with emptiness, but his body screamed that if he turned, something would be waiting. He stepped inside. The doors clamped shut with finality. On the nearest bed, a sheet had slipped down, revealing a pale hand. The fingers curled like talons, nails cracked and blackened. Adrian clutched the folder. He turned to the last page. Only one sentence was written there in heavy ink. "Do not look directly at them." The air thickened. The synchronized breathing of the figures faltered, grew ragged, as though dozens of unseen eyes had shifted toward him. He squeezed his eyes shut, but instinct betrayed him. His gaze flicked sideways. From the corner of vision, something rose, too tall, joints bending backward, head lolling like a puppet raised by unseen strings. The light snapped out. In the darkness, breath brushed his ear. A voice whispered, "You've been here longer than you think." The elevator rattled with each passing floor, its panels groaning like old bones. Adrian pressed his back against the wall, clutching the folder as though it alone tethered him to reality. His fingers trembled, slick with sweat, and when the folder slipped, papers spilled like pale feathers onto the floor. He bent to retrieve them, but the words had shifted. What had once been patient records now looked like fragments of a fever dream. Sentences overlapped, letters bled into one another. Across every page, the same command appeared, handwritten in uneven strokes. "Don't open your eyes." Adrian's chest tightened. He blinked hard, hoping the letters would realign into something logical, but the phrase only multiplied. The ink seemed alive, crawling toward the edges of the page. A chime broke the silence. The door slid open. The corridor beyond was too bright, bathed in a sterile glow that stung his eyes. Nurses pushed carts in perfect synchronization, their shoes clicking with mechanical precision. None looked at him, yet he felt scrutinized. Their faces were nearly identical, same pale skin, same painted smile. His footsteps echoed while theirs made no sound. The farther he walked, the more distorted the corridor became, its geometry bending in subtle ways, like a drawing seen through warped glass. At the end stood a door unlike the others. Painted black, its surface absorbed the light around it. Adrian moved toward it despite the protest of his nerves. Each step seemed chosen for him, as if resistance no longer mattered. The door opened before he touched it. Beyond lay a stairwell spiraling down into shadow. The walls were damp concrete, sweating in the cold air. His hand brushed the railing. It felt warm, as though something alive pulsed beneath the steel. He descended. With each step, the echo multiplied, not only below but also above, until he swore others walked with him, invisible yet near. A sound reached him, breathing, slow, heavy, deliberate. Not his own. From the gloom emerged a figure. Tall, draped in a hospital gown, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its face was blurred, features smeared like wet paint. The air chilled as it ascended. Adrian spun, running upward, but the stairs stretched without end. Each landing curved into another, a loop with no escape. His lungs screamed, legs weak, yet when he glanced back, the figure was closer, climbing at a leisurely pace that defied logic. Then a door appeared above him. He threw it open, stumbling into another corridor. Ceiling tiles sagged, wires dangled like vines, and the floor was littered with broken glass. Faint whispers seeped from the walls. The plate on the door was crooked, the paint peeling in familiar cracks. He had left it behind, yet it had found him again. The knob turned on its own. The door opened. Inside, the bed was no longer empty. A figure lay beneath a thin sheet. Adrian approached, dread weighing every step. He tugged the cover back. It was himself. He saw his own pale face, eyes closed, machines humming quietly. The monitor beside the bed displayed his name in glowing letters. His heart stumbled as he reached to touch the hand, his own hand, resting limply on the blanket. The eyes snapped open. They were hollow, pools of black that reflected nothing. His own voice slithered out from those lips. "You never left this bed." The monitor blared, flatlines screaming into the air. The walls trembled. Outside, the corridor erupted with sound. Wheels screeching, many feet pounding, voices moaning. Shadows danced against the blinds, shapes with too many arms, limbs bending the wrong way. The paint cracked, exposing what looked like veins throbbing beneath, flesh pulsing as if the building itself were alive. Adrian staggered back, bolting from the room. The corridors twisted endlessly, each corner leading him back to the same flickering lights, the same peeling paint. He ran until his muscles burned, yet every hallway felt identical, as though the hospital itself folded around him. Figures darted at the edge of his vision, blurred nurses, patients with distorted faces, silhouettes limping yet fast. They whispered his name in tones not quite human. At last he reached a dead end. A mirror blocked his way. He froze. The reflection showed him again in the hospital bed, surrounded by doctors. Their mouths moved frantically, though no sound carried. Electrodes dotted his chest. IV lines snaked into his arms. His reflection's hand rose, pressing against the glass. A voice seeped directly into his mind, cold and intimate. "Do you want to wake up, or do you want to stay with us?" Adrian moved deeper into the hospital, but each corridor bent unnaturally, like the geometry resisted him. The air grew heavier, damp, clinging to his lungs. The fluorescent lights flickered above, not randomly, but in rhythm, like a code only he was meant to decipher. He whispered to himself, trying to remember why he had entered this part of the building, but memory frayed the moment he touched it. A sound trailed him, a faint humming pulsing beneath the floor. It mimicked his heartbeat, adjusting whenever his pulse raced. He pressed his hand against the wall. It throbbed back, soft, almost fleshy. At the far end of the corridor stood wheelchairs arranged neatly. Their metal frames gleamed faintly, reflecting the harsh light. When he stepped closer, they shifted. No more than a fraction of an inch, but enough to prove they weren't lifeless. His stomach lurched. He turned away and shoved through the nearest door. Inside was a ward, rows of beds stretched into shadow, sheets tucked with ritual precision. He inhaled the sterile air, heavy with bleach, yet beneath it came another scent, iron. He forced his gaze forward, yet from the edges of sight the sheets rippled, rising as though unseen figures stirred beneath them. He blinked, everything lay flat again. It floated from nowhere, brushing past his ear like warm breath. He froze, throat dry. The whisper came again, louder. Behind him, a tray of instruments rattled. Scalpels and forceps lined like sharp smiles. One scalpel rolled free and clattered against the floor. The metallic note echoed unnaturally long, vibrating in his skull. Every sheet on every bed lifted at once. They swelled like lungs filling, shapes forming beneath. A figure detached itself from the farthest shadows and stepped into the light. It wore a surgeon's mask, stretched too tight, the fabric bulging from some wrong shape beneath. Its eyes glowed pale white as if lit by X-ray film. In one hand, it held a clipboard stacked with paper. Adrian's breath caught when he saw the writing, his own. Pages of his journals, thoughts he'd never shown anyone, even fragments he'd only half-formed in his head. He staggered back. No, I didn't. The floor beneath him darkened, dampness seeping upward. A thick metallic smell filled the air as blood welled through the tiles, spreading like an unstoppable tide. Adrian ran, slipping, crashing through another door. The hallway twisted downward. Rusted pipes hissed overhead, coughing bursts of steam that burned his skin. He stumbled toward a sign at the end, letters barely clinging to corroded metal. Morgue. His stomach dropped, but the corridor ended there. The morgue door gaped open, breathing out a cold fog. Each tag bore the same name, Adrian. His breath shortened. The first drawer slid open with a screech. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound of drawers sliding open multiplied, metal shrieking from every direction. The floor cracked, dropping him into a spiral stairwell that coiled endlessly downward. He tumbled, bruising against concrete, until he collapsed on a narrow landing. It wasn't wood or steel, it was flesh. Its surface shivered under his palm, warm and beating faintly like muscle. Beyond was a chamber of glass partitions. Inside one, strapped to a chair, was himself again. Its lips moved, silent at first. Then speakers crackled overhead, releasing a voice. "You never left me. You're still here." The reflection mouthed the words with mechanical precision, eyes fixed on Adrian. He slammed his fists against the glass. Cracks spread outward, but not from his blows. The machine screamed alarms. The chamber shook violently, monitors bursting in sparks. Adrian stumbled, blinded by light as the glass shattered outward. The last thing he saw was his own face stepping free, calm and smiling, whispering his name. Darkness swallowed everything. The door rasped like a throat-clearing rust. Adrian pushed, and a slice of stale chemical air slid over him. The observation room was a small theater. Chairs bolted to the floor, a stubborn lamp, walls of one-way mirrors veined by fractures. He saw himself in every direction, duplicated and thinned. On the desk lay a patient file furred with dust. He resisted the urge to blow it away. This place punished sudden movement with echo. Inside were pages of slanted handwriting. He knew the pressure of the pen, the hooked G, entry after entry read like confessions by someone he didn't remember being. I hear footsteps that synchronize with mine, then overtake me, then hide. The man in the glass keeps smiling wider until his cheeks look like torn pockets. When I wake, a cold strap is around my wrist. When I sleep, someone loosens it. Heat gathered behind his eyes, a fever called by name. The last page had no date, only, "You will arrive here again when the room remembers you." Across the mirrors, something adjusted like a sleeper twitching. For one breath, the reflections stayed obedient. Then one lifted its head a beat late. A third smiled after his mouth stayed flat. "Stop," he said, not sure whom he addressed. A reflection to his left showed a thin surgical seam from ear to jaw, an extra smile. Another wore a cap and a mask dark with dried something. The nearest mirror brightened, as if lit from within. Shapes moved behind the glass, a viewing gallery, empty, yet heavy with the patience of auditors. He remembered the theater upstairs where students watched through glass while a body was opened and corrected. Watching must have trained the mirrors to keep the habit. It made no sound, like a thought finally kept. Panels of reflective night stretched away. If there had been a door, the mirrors had edited it from the script. He chose left. The copies chose otherwise, angling with the grace of actors who rehearsed a part he forgot auditioning for. In one pane, he was strapped to a gurney, throat working, no voice. In another, he wore a surgeon's coat with his surname where a heart should be. In a third, he lay under a sheet that covered all but the curve of a foot. "Which one am I?" The question multiplied and returned as a chorus. The lamp sighed into life. The mirrors clarified. Center stage stood a bed with rails raised. On it lay a body with his profile. The stillness wasn't theatrical, it was bureaucratic. Adrian approached with hands half raised, a thief begging the dark not to notice. The nearer he came, the more he recognized the small scar on his cheekbone and the ear that never sat flat. The eyelids were a fraction open, the gray of clouded water. A monitor woke somewhere behind him. The sound was clinical, forgiving. Beep, beep, beep. He looked for wires and found none. The leads hung like vines, clipped to nothing, beeping anyway, diligent and detached. He almost laughed. The laugh arrived in the mirrors first. "Don't," a voice said near his ear, patient as a hand on a fevered forehead. The voice repeated, now from the vent, now from the floor. He reached toward the body. The mirrors moved first. Every reflection of his hand touched the reflected sheet, connected, completed. His real fingers halted above cold skin. The difference between touching and not touching became enormous, like a border where language stops working. All the other versions bowed their heads in the same degree. Adrian's knees faltered, breath thinned to a thread. He whispered to the body, to himself, to the room that had learned him too well. "If I wake you, do I disappear or multiply?" A soft wind rolled through the vents, smelling of alcohol and winter. The overheads dimmed. One light remained, a pale circle above the bed. With the new shadow, the bed seemed farther away. The mirror to his right went black, becoming a door that did not open. Somewhere outside the walls, a clock sobbed itself to a stop. He lowered his hand until his fingertips met the sheet. The contact was colder than truth, but every mirror flinched as if roused from disciplined sleep. A handwritten line appeared beneath the reflected bed card, the ink writing itself. He leaned closer and read the name. His. Then the dates, beginning and ending, wrote themselves at once. On the real rail, there was only a blank tag swaying, as if a passerby had brushed it a second ago. He looked up in time to see his favorite version, the quiet one in the far pane, raise a finger to its lips. The voice returned for a final kindness. "You only change which glass believes you." The corridor that received him after the mirror chamber was narrower, lined with chipped tiles that had forgotten their colors. Overhead, a single row of fluorescent lights struggled against their age. They did not flicker together, each hummed in its own private rhythm, like teeth chattering out of sync. Adrian's steps slowed when he saw the clock. It was bolted high above a nurse's station that had long been stripped of paperwork, pens, and people. The round face of the clock gleamed faintly under its casing, but the glass was spiderwebbed with cracks. For a moment, he thought the second hand was steady, simply refusing to move. Then he realized it was moving, backward. Tick by tick, the red hand clawed its way into the past. The minute hand jerked in reluctant sympathy, while the hour hand twitched as though unwilling to follow. Adrian stared, his breathing shallow, until the hands reversed course again. They jumped forward, then backward, shivering between the two. The effect was nauseating. Time was not passing, it was rehearsing. A shiver worked its way into him. He turned away, but the clock's echo remained in his chest like a second heartbeat. From the ceiling speaker came a voice, distorted and monotone, as though broadcast from the bottom of water. "Patient 17, please report to operating theater B." The syllables rolled down the empty hallway, then repeated with a slight delay, as if replayed from another recording. "Patient 17, please report." The sound folded into itself, layering and thinning until the corridor was nothing but the voice calling for the same figure again and again. Adrian's mouth dried. He knew the number. In the file he had touched, in the reports he had only dared glance at, there had been a reference, Subject 17, Adrian K. It was his designation. The hospital was not announcing him to others. It was summoning him to himself. The air seemed to thicken. The tiles under his shoes grew sticky, as though reluctant to release him. He turned toward the nearest doorway just to break the call. The room was a waiting lounge, chairs arranged in rows that pretended at order. Not a soul filled them. Yet every chair bore the impression of a body. Faint hollows, fabric stretched, arms of the seats smudged as if gripped recently. The air above each cushion shimmered with a heat that did not belong to an abandoned hospital. Adrian whispered, "Who was here?" The room answered not with sight, but with sound. From the far corner came a brief laughter, childlike, high, quickly smothered. Another chair gave back a sigh. Then from three directions at once came the weary shuffling of restless shoes on linoleum. He backed away until he stood in the doorway again. But the air in the corridor was worse, dense with static, every light buzzing like a swarm hidden in the ceiling. The clock chimed, not 12 times, not any count he recognized. A metallic bell hammered, accelerating until it became a single tone, a scream made of brass. The cracked glass face vibrated, and for a second the hands stopped trying to choose a direction. Both collapsed straight downward, pinned to 6. The speaker clicked on again. This time the voice was not monotone. It was gentle, rehearsed, soothing, like a nurse trained to comfort a terminal patient. 17, your time has ended. Please lie down for the procedure. Every chair in the waiting room creaked at once, as though invisible figures obeyed the instruction. The hollow seats exhaled, fabric rising. Adrian stumbled back, his shoulder striking the wall. "No," he croaked, though he could not decide whether he refused the voice, the command, or the knowledge of what number he was. The clock above the nurse's desk gave a final convulsion. Its cracked glass fell in a rain of shards, yet no sound of shattering reached the floor. The fragments hung suspended in the air, each piece trembling with a reflection of Adrian's face. Dozens of tiny Adrians stared back at him, some frightened, some calm, some blank. They rotated slowly, orbiting a center that was nothing at all. The bell tone returned, soft this time, like a lullaby's single note. The suspended shards reassembled into a shape. Not a clock now, but a wheel with no numbers, no beginning, no end. The red second hand floated free, circling on its own, pointing and pointing and pointing, always at him. Adrian pressed his back to the wall, sliding down until he sat on the cold tile. His reflection in the shards followed suit, hundreds of him crouching at once. The speaker breathed one last sentence. "You are not late, you are simply repeating." And then silence, except for the soft echo of a clock that no longer existed, ticking inside his chest. The silence that followed the clock's collapse stretched too long, like a string pulled until it thinned to nothing. Adrian rose slowly, his knees reluctant, his breath carrying the taste of dust and copper. He found himself drawn back toward the waiting lounge he had glimpsed before, the place where empty chairs bore the memory of bodies. The doorway gaped. Inside, the air felt heavier, as though the room had aged between glances. The chairs were no longer merely indented. They seemed occupied, though no one could be seen. The cushions sagged, armrests bent slightly inward, and faint indentations deepened under invisible weight. Adrian stepped across the threshold. The doorframe shivered as though he had passed through a boundary not meant for him. He counted the chairs without meaning to. 22. arranged in uneven rows. His chest tightened at the discovery that 21 of them appeared filled. Only one seat remained untouched, pristine, upright, its surface too smooth, too expectant. The untouched chair faced directly toward him. "No," he muttered. The word crumbled in his throat. The air pressure changed. Somewhere in the unseen ductwork, a low vibration began, like the drone of fluorescent tubes, but deeper, more human. It carried the texture of voices overlapping, whispers layered on sighs, forming a sound that was neither language nor static. From the left, he heard a cough. From the right, a sniffle. Then, unmistakably, a sob. The sound rose, multiplied, until the waiting room pulsed with an invisible crowd. Adrian's eyes darted. He could not see them, but he felt the stares. A sensation pricked the back of his neck, as if 21 unseen gazes had settled there. His palms sweated. He approached one chair and leaned close. The seat cushion bore the unmistakable weight of someone sitting. The fabric stretched taut. Yet when he extended a trembling hand to test the air, his fingers passed through nothing but chill. The cushion did not rise. He staggered back, his heel catching against another chair leg. It screeched faintly against the floor, but no occupant protested. The whispers rose in intensity, merging into a strange chant. He could almost hear words surfacing. "Wait, wait, wait." The syllables drummed in his skull like the beating of wings. Then the speaker crackled overhead once more, startling him into stillness. The same calm, bureaucratic voice spoke. 17, your place is reserved. Sit down, remain until called. Adrian's chest tightened. He glanced again at the untouched chair. Its straightness had become grotesque, too rigid, too welcoming. The floor beneath it gleamed faintly, as if freshly polished in anticipation. "I won't," Adrian whispered. His voice trembled. "I won't sit." The room did not approve. A sudden draft swept across the chairs, carrying the sour-sweet smell of antiseptic and sweat. The invisible occupants sighed in unison like a choir of the weary. The untouched chair creaked, though no one had touched it, shifting minutely closer to him. Adrian stumbled back until his shoulders struck the wall. His heartbeat thundered. The fluorescent light above buzzed louder, then popped, leaving the room half-shrouded in shadow. In the dimness, the seated impressions deepened. The weight on the cushions grew heavier, the armrests groaning. Some invisible occupants leaned forward, their unseen mass distorting the air, their breath faintly fogging the cold. Adrian's legs weakened. He slid sideways along the wall, trying to find the door again. But the doorway had blurred, as if painted over with shade. The only thing visible in the haze was the pristine chair, gleaming pale, perfectly empty, perfectly patient. The chant of whispers returned, louder now, not words, but pressure. The untouched chair creaked again, sliding half a meter forward across the linoleum with a sound like bones dragging. Adrian froze. His breath hitched. The chair waited, unwavering. The voice from the speaker returned, firmer this time. "You are not dismissed. You are expected." The 21 invisible presences shifted in approval. A wave of motion passed through the room, unseen bodies leaning forward, unseen eyes turning sharper. Adrian clutched his head, closing his eyes. He imagined what would happen if he obeyed, if he sank into that chair, straps clicking, walls closing, time locking. When he opened his eyes again, the untouched chair was directly in front of him. He had not seen it move. It simply was there, claiming space, offering inevitability. Adrian fell to his knees. His vision blurred with panic, tears streaking his face. He whispered again, but now to himself, "If I sit, I never rise. If I refuse, I never leave." The lights buzzed, then died completely. Darkness smothered the room. In the pitch black, every whisper merged into one long exhale, like the sigh of a crowd finally satisfied. Adrian had long since stopped counting doors, corridors, or the echoes of his own footsteps. The waiting room, the clock, the chairs, they all bled into each other, leaving him unmoored in the architecture of the hospital. A faint metallic clink drew his attention. Somewhere ahead, the long shadow of a figure stretched along the cracked tiles. Adrian froze. The silhouette moved fluidly, yet there was no discernible source of light. The figure's head was bowed, and the hands gripped an object that gleamed faintly, cold steel reflecting the flickering overheads. "A scalpel," he swallowed. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the rhythmic scraping of the instrument against the floor. Adrian's steps faltered, unsure whether to approach or retreat. The shadow paused at the intersection of two hallways, then lifted its head. The mask was obscured, the features indiscernible. But the tilt of the head, the deliberate slowness, screamed anticipation. Adrian's pulse surged. He ducked behind a corner, pressing his back against the grimy wall. His eyes flicked across the hallway. The shadow continued its advance, unhurried yet relentless, moving closer with each heartbeat he felt thumping in his chest. The overhead light flickered. In that split second, Adrian thought he saw the mask shift, eyes black, hollow, staring into his own. Then, as the light steadied, the shadow had vanished, but the sense of being watched remained. He crept forward. The hallway opened into a small surgical prep room. Tables were stained, instruments still arranged as if a procedure had been paused mid-motion. A faint mist hovered just above the floor. The scalpel lay abandoned on the edge of a table, yet Adrian could feel the presence of the shadow even as he stepped closer. The mirror on the far wall reflected nothing of the room, only him, or rather, versions of him. One crouched behind the surgical table, another leaned forward over the instrument tray, and a third lay still on a bed, eyes wide open, mouth silent. They moved independently, yet in perfect mimicry of his hesitation. A metallic rasp echoed behind him. He spun, but there was nothing. The door slammed shut on its own, shaking the walls with authority. The scalpel quivered atop the table, then slid toward the center of the room as if propelled by an unseen hand. Adrian's reflection in the mirror no longer matched his movements. His mirrored self raised an arm he did not move, pointing directly at him. He staggered back, but the mirrored hand continued its accusation, the scalpel reflecting light like a predator's eye. The air thickened. Adrian could feel the shadow pressing against his spine, though there was no one there. His breathing became shallow, his throat dry as dust. The whisper came, low, almost a hiss. 17, your turn. He ran toward the only exit. The door, which had slammed shut moments before, resisted his push. Every handle he tried slipped beneath his fingers, impossibly cold, unyielding. Behind him, the faint scraping of the scalpel returned, closer, circling, deliberate. Adrian's mind reeled. The surgical room seemed to stretch, the walls elongating, the floor slanting under him. He could feel the shadow materializing around the corners of his vision, always present, never fully visible, moving as if anticipating his next step. He glanced at the mirror again. The multiple versions of himself were now nearer, their eyes glassy and accusing. Some held knives. One reflection mimicked the shadow exactly, raising the scalpel in synchronized motion. The whisper came again, now layered with dozens of other faint voices, all saying the same thing. 17. Lie down. It is time. Adrian stumbled backward, his back hit a cold metal table. He looked up, and there it was, the shadow fully revealed in the reflection. Not a person, but a shape of black smoke, eyes glowing faintly through the surgical mask. The scalpel floated between its hands, tip glinting. Everything slowed. Adrian's heart thundered. His mind screamed. He raised his hands, trembling. The shadow mirrored every gesture, then lowered the scalpel to hover just above his shoulder, close enough to pierce, yet never touching. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the echo of his own ragged breaths. The shadow leaned forward, closer and closer, until it seemed to seep into him. Then, abruptly, it recoiled. The scalpel fell, clattering to the floor. The mirrors blinked, his reflections scattered and rearranged. The doors opened with a hiss, inviting him to step through, but the whispers lingered, warning, haunting. You can run, but every hallway ends in me. Every mirror waits, you are never alone. Adrian didn't hesitate. He fled, leaving the room, the shadow, the scalpel, and the reflected versions of himself behind. But somewhere deep inside, he knew that every step carried him closer to repetition, and every hallway would remember him when the lights dimmed. Adrian's legs burned as he ran down the endless hallways, each corner folding into another, each door a promise of escape that dissolved into shadows. The whispers of the hospital followed him, twisting, overlapping, repeating fragments of his own name. 17. He stumbled into a ward he had not seen before. The air smelled of antiseptic and rot, of cold steel and something warmer, darker. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting jagged shadows across the beds that lined the room. Most were empty, draped in thin white sheets like waiting canvases. But one bed, at the very center, drew his gaze immediately. Its rails were polished, shining under the trembling light, and on the small nameplate rested the words that made his stomach tighten. Adrian K., the hum of the hospital vibrating through the soles of his shoes. The bed was pristine, unnervingly so, and yet something about it called to him, demanded attention. A thin fog curled along the floor, swirling around his ankles as though urging him closer. Then he saw it, himself. Lying on the bed, pale, eyes half open, chest motionless, the faint rise and fall of emptiness beneath the sheet. The sight tore something in his chest, a mix of disbelief and something deeper, a recognition too horrible to name. Adrian froze. Every instinct screamed to run, yet his legs refused to obey. His reflection in the nearby windows, distorted and warped by grime, multiplied the terror. Dozens of versions of himself crouched, stared, and reached silently from the shadows. A soft click sounded behind him. He spun. The door had closed. The ward was quiet except for the distant drip of water from the cracked ceiling tile. Yet in the stillness he could hear the faintest shuffle of footsteps. No one in sight, circling, always approaching, always retreating. He looked down at the body on the bed. The eyes were slightly open now, glimmering in the dim light. Not fully alive, not fully dead, the monitors above, though lacking any wires, began to emit a slow, steady beep, 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 synchronizing with his racing pulse. Adrian's hands trembled. He reached forward, daring to touch the sheet. The fabric felt impossibly cold, as if the warmth of life had never existed there. His fingers brushed the shoulder, and a jolt ran up his spine, sharp and silent. Every mirror he had passed, every shadow he had evaded, seemed to converge on this single moment. In the reflections of the windows, the ward multiplied, walls doubled, beds stretched into infinity, and his own reflection stood atop each bed, staring at him, silent, accusing. Each version held something different, some pale, some bruised, some smiling in grotesque anticipation. Then, from the corner of the room, a voice emerged. Not over a speaker, not carried through ducts, but from everywhere at once. You have arrived, and yet you never left. Adrian tried to respond, but his throat was dry. Words lost before they formed. The fog thickened, wrapping around his knees and rising along his body. He felt himself drawn forward toward the bed, toward the version of himself he could not leave behind. The reflections in the windows began to merge, forming a single warped image of his own face. Lips moved silently, eyes blinking in perfect synchrony. Every detail of his fear exaggerated and mirrored infinitely. He stumbled backward. The bed seemed to stretch toward him, its rails elongating, the sheet crawling up like living tissue. Every hallway he had passed, every mirror he had avoided, every shadow he had fled, all of it converged here. The unseen audience of the hospital whispered, their tones blending into a singular exhalation. Inevitability. Adrian's knees gave way. He fell to the floor, hands clutching the edge of the bed. The reflected versions reached for him, pressing closer, pulling, their whispers swirling into his mind. He screamed, but the sound was absorbed, swallowed by the room itself, stirring the fog into twisting shapes that danced around him, forming skeletal hands that grasped at his sleeves and hair. The light flickered again, and for a fleeting instant, he saw the bed occupied by countless Adrians, stacked like reflections in an infinite hall of mirrors, each silently watching him struggle. The single overhead light above the bed stabilized. In that beam, the bed and its occupant were perfectly visible, perfectly still. Adrian's vision blurred, his breath became shallow. The whispers faded into a low, unbroken hum, as if the entire ward were holding its breath. And then, as he reached toward the bed one final time, the fog consumed him entirely. His hands found only emptiness. The reflections blinked out, the shadows receded, and silence enveloped the room. The only sound that remained was the soft, steady beat of a heart, or perhaps the echo of one long lost. Adrian did not rise. He simply became part of the waiting, a new whisper among many, a reflection in a room that waited for no one. Adrian's pulse steadied when he saw it, a red sign glowing faintly at the end of the corridor. Exit. For the first time since stepping into this labyrinth of silence, there was a direction, a promise of release. His legs moved on their own, each step fueled by desperate hope. The corridor narrowed as he walked, yet the sign remained constant, pulsing like a beacon in the void. The air shifted around him. It grew warmer, then colder, then utterly still, as though the world itself had paused. His ears rang, his heartbeat echoed in his skull. The glowing red letters wavered as though submerged in water, but they never disappeared. They beckoned him forward. Finally, Adrian reached the metal door. His trembling hand grasped the handle. It was shockingly cold, almost burning his skin. He hesitated. Something whispered, "This isn't what you think it is." But the alternative, staying here forever, was unbearable. He pushed. Light spilled in, golden and soft, so different from the sterile fluorescence of the hospital. It stung his eyes, forced him to stumble forward. Air filled his lungs, fresh and intoxicating. Grass brushed his shoes and a gentle wind tangled his hair. The world sharpened into view. A quiet street, lampposts flickering, the outline of distant buildings. He laughed, half sob, half disbelief. He had made it. He was free. But something was wrong. The lampposts were the same he had passed earlier, the same cracks in the pavement, the same black stains beneath the light. He turned, expecting the hospital to shrink behind him. Instead, the doors were still there. Still open, still waiting. Adrian's chest tightened. He forced himself forward. The streets stretched on, but there were no people, no cars, no hum of life, only silence. He turned corner after corner, left, right, again and again. Each path bent back, returning him to the hospital. It loomed larger each time, its windows like black eyes. The exit sign above the doors glowed faintly, taunting him. He sank to his knees, hands clawing the pavement. The ground pulsed faintly, alive, as if the city itself were an extension of the hospital. Maybe he had never left. Maybe he had never been outside at all. He stumbled forward, staggering, legs trembling, lungs burning. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. The sky never changed. Night was endless. Occasionally, pale faces appeared in the dark windows, vanishing when he looked closer. His own reflection stared back, stretched and wrong, distorted by shadows. He whispered streets and numbers to himself, trying to anchor reality, but each word slipped away. His voice returned in fragments, delayed and mocking, as though the city were speaking through him. Shadows shifted along the walls. Shapes moved just beyond his vision. Sometimes he thought he felt fingers brush his shoulder or heard soft footsteps behind him, echoing in rhythm with his own. He spun, but no one was there. Only the empty streets bending back toward the hospital like an unbroken circle. Finally, he fell against a lamppost. The metal throbbed faintly against his cheek, warm and alive. The city, the hospital, was breathing with him. There was no outside, only the illusion of it. With trembling steps, he turned back. The hospital loomed impossibly close, doors yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. His strength broke. He walked forward, unable to resist. Inside, the corridor awaited. Cold, sterile, empty. The red exit sign flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness swallowed it. A suffocating silence pressed down. His breathing no longer sounded like his own. The walls inhaled with him, exhaled with him, swallowing each breath. He pressed his palm against the doorframe. Gone. Replaced by smooth, seamless wall. He spun, but every hallway stretched endlessly. No landmarks, no signs. Shadows deepened, twisting along the walls. The smell of grass, the feel of wind, the memory of daylight dissolved. In its place came the antiseptic sting of disinfectant, the whisper of unseen curtains, the faint hum of machines that might not exist. His mind raced. Was he dreaming? Was he dead? Had he ever been alive outside these walls? The answers slipped away like water through fingers. The hospital had swallowed all certainty. He realized the world beyond had never existed. Only a mask, a lure. When it fell, nothing remained but the hospital, infinite, alive, hungry. Adrian's lips trembled as he whispered, "There is no exit." The walls seemed to tighten in agreement. The shadows deepened, stretching long and dark as if smiling. Adrian sank to the floor, the cold seeping through his bones, knowing, finally, that escape was impossible. His last thought faded. Even his own memory might belong to the hospital now. The stage dissolved into something unstable. One moment it was a theater with crimson curtains, the next a surgical ward, then a corridor of white tiles stretching forever. Spaces bled into each other, reality melting and reforming around him. Adrian stood at the center, his shoes clicking against a floor that sometimes felt like wood, sometimes tile, sometimes nothing at all. A cold draft whispered along his spine, though no windows existed. The air pressed against his lungs. Sterile, metallic, tinged with sweetness like ether, it coated his throat. Somewhere a machine ticked, uneven, mechanical, yet oddly alive. Its rhythm resembled a heartbeat but stuttered, refusing consistency. Each click echoed inside his skull, marking the erosion of something fragile. He lifted his hands and realized they trembled, as though something inside him vibrated against the bones. A resonance he could neither control nor name. An audience waited. He could not see them clearly, but their presence burned on his skin. Shadows filled the seats, rows of human shapes, too still, too identical. Their heads tilted the same way, every gesture choreographed. When Adrian blinked, they did not. When he shifted, they leaned forward as one. He felt their gaze compressing his chest until he tasted dust, iron, and a faint bitterness of fear. He tried to speak, but the moment he opened his mouth, his throat sealed itself. Silence became command. Above, a voice filled the space, neither male nor female. Subject observed. Cycle repeating, identity erosion progressing. The syllables cut through him sharper than a scalpel, leaving an invisible sting on the mind. Mirrors sprouted from the walls, multiplying until the theater became a labyrinth of reflections. His face confronted him from every angle, pale, trembling, endlessly fractured, yet each was wrong. In one he was older, in another a child, in another his chest was split open, though the body still smiled faintly back. He staggered, and the reflections staggered differently, each version obeying its own rhythm, as though none of them were truly his. Adrian reached for the glass. The reflection leaned closer, lips cracked, mouthing words he could not hear. Still, meaning pressed into his mind, "You are not the observer, you are the observed." The words burrowed so deep that his vision blurred, the edges of the room melting like wax. The curtains shivered. Shadows leaned forward in unison, anticipation thick enough to suffocate. His pulse thundered, merging with the irregular ticking of the unseen machine. Applause heartbeat? He no longer knew. The floor beneath him seemed to pulse as if alive, sending tremors up through his legs. Without warning, the lights flared, the piercing white of surgical lamps. When it thinned, he realized he was no longer standing, but lying flat. Straps cut into his wrists and ankles. The air buzzed with electricity. His own breath bounced back against the mask strapped to his face, fogging the edges. A figure loomed above him, masked gowned. But the eyes, his own, Adrian struggled, but the restraints bit deeper. The figure leaned closer, and for a heartbeat, he felt his own breath blowing back onto his face. The machine clicked again, uneven, mocking. Around the table, mirrors reappeared. Dozens of Adrians watched him from every angle. Some thrashed violently, others lay still, resigned. A few smiled in eerie calm. One bled from the eyes, another's jaw unhinged too far, another's chest rose and fell long after breath should have stopped. Adrian's throat filled with a scream that never reached air. Then, from beyond the lamps, the crimson curtain swayed again. The unseen audience leaned closer, shadows tilting forward in perfect unison. Adrian's chest heaved as though the air had turned to liquid. He could taste copper. He could feel inevitability pressing against his ribs. A faint echo of laughter, or was it his own, traveled along the walls, unseen yet unmistakable. The masked figure reached for a scalpel that gleamed too brightly. Its blade hovered above his chest, multiplied endlessly in every mirror. A countdown voice whispered, "Observation concluding. Identity collapse imminent." Adrian's heart faltered. For an instant, he felt as though he were both lying on the table and standing in the shadows, watching himself writhe. The mirrors flickered, showing him alive, then dead, then absent altogether. His pulse became the stage's metronome, each thud followed by a silence longer than the last. The scalpel lowered, the curtain rippled. The audience leaned as one. And as the final hum of the machine aligned with his fading pulse, darkness fell, not sudden but absolute, consuming everything like a closing eye. The last sensation Adrian felt was the weight of countless gazes collapsing into him, as if the world itself had turned inward and left nothing outside. Adrian opened his eyes slowly, his breath shallow as though he had been drowning for hours. He expected to see surgical lights above him or straps digging into his wrists, but instead he found himself seated on a long row of plastic chairs in a waiting room. The fluorescent lamps overhead buzzed with a faint electric hum, flickering in irregular intervals, casting shadows that seemed to move without reason. At first glance, it looked ordinary, almost mundane, like any hospital waiting area. White walls, antiseptic smell, informational posters peeling at the edges. Yet the silence was unbearable. So heavy it felt physical, pressing down on his chest. He tried to laugh at himself. Perhaps all of it, screams, mirrors, the files, had been nothing more than hallucination, a nightmare from exhaustion. But the laugh caught in his throat, because as his gaze drifted across the room, his blood froze. Every seat was filled, not with strangers, not with patients, but with himself. Dozens of Adrians sat shoulder to shoulder, each one wearing a slightly different expression. One grinned with hollow eyes, another covered his face in despair, another looked directly at him with a stare so sharp it cut through the air. Some looked bruised, some stitched, some pale as corpses. They weren't reflections, these were bodies, breathing, blinking, existing. Adrian stood, but the others stood too, perfectly synchronized like a row of puppets waiting for a single hand to pull the strings. His throat tightened, his pulse hammering. He wanted to run, yet his legs felt locked in invisible chains. "Next patient, please." The voice was calm, female, emotionless. A nurse stood at the far end of the hall, half her face obscured by a surgical mask. Her eyes, dark, sharp, unblinking, fixed only on him. Or was it on all of them? Adrian couldn't tell. The silence shattered as the identical rows of Adrians began to shuffle toward the nurse, yet somehow it was his own feet that moved first, obeying without consent. The hallway stretched endlessly. The walls gleamed with sterile white paint, yet the air grew colder the further he walked, each breath leaving faint fog before his lips. Glass windows lined one side of the hall, and every pane revealed not just his reflection, but versions of himself he did not remember being. One window showed him as a child, sick and weak in a hospital bed. Another showed him older, strapped to a gurney, screaming. Another revealed him stitched like a corpse, yet still breathing. Each image lingered even after he passed, as though the glass preserved fragments of his soul. He whispered to himself, "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the words died in the cold air. Finally, the nurse stopped before a door marked with a rusted sign, Ward 0. She opened it without looking back. Inside, the lights flickered slower, the shadows thicker. Adrian stepped in hesitantly, and the door sealed shut behind him with a sound that felt final. The room was vast, yet empty except for a single hospital bed in the center. On it lay another Adrian, his own body, eyes closed, chest barely rising with shallow breaths. Machines stood around the bed, but none were connected. The body lived without wires, without tubes, as though it was breathing only because something refused to let it die. He approached, trembling, staring at his own still face. Suddenly, the eyes snapped open. The other Adrian smiled. "You've been here all along," the voice said, not spoken aloud, but inside his skull, vibrating through his bones. The files, the mirrors, the corridors. "You are not the patient, you are the hospital." Adrian staggered back, denial boiling in his chest. The floor beneath his feet pulsed like flesh, veins crawling across the tiles. The walls exhaled with a wet sigh. He clutched his head, memories crashing in, not of doctors, not of nurses, but of himself watching, observing, cataloging pain, experimenting, repeating. He turned to the nurse for help, but she was gone. Only rows of chairs remained, filling again with countless Adrians, their stares fixed on him. He realized with horror that he was not waiting for treatment. He was waiting for himself, forever on repeat. The other Adrian on the bed whispered one last time, lips curling into something between a grin and a grimace. "Welcome back, Doctor." The fluorescent lights flickered violently, buzzing like angry insects. Then, in the instant of blackout, Adrian felt the weight of every gaze, every version of himself, merging into one truth. There was never an escape. The hospital had no walls, no corridors, no end. It was him, and he was it. An eternal loop of fear and recognition. And the lights went out.